Welcome to this latest webinar brought to you by Veeam. I'm your host, David Howell, the Editor-in-Chief here at Silicon UK. Veeam provides a single platform for modernising backup, accelerating hybrid cloud and securing data. Veeam has 400,000 customers worldwide, including 82% of the Fortune 500 and 69% of the Global 2000. Veeam's 100% channel ecosystem includes global partners as well as HP, NetApp and Cisco and Lenovo as exclusive resellers and boasts more than 35,000 transaction partners worldwide. In this webinar, we're considering a timely topic of Microsoft 365 backup. The webinar delivers an insightful checklist that you can use as you evaluate third-party vendors of your Microsoft 360 backup strategy. Even if you already have a backup solution, learn how to augment your existing strategy to continue your success this year. In this presentation, you'll also get to learn about the number one Microsoft 365 backup solution, the Veeam Backup for Microsoft 365. Well, today I'm delighted to welcome Mircea Dragomir, the systems engineer for Veeam Software. Welcome, Mircea.
Welcome, David. Nice to meet you.
Well, thanks for joining us today. As I said for the introduction, I think Veeam has a very interesting, application in this space. I guess we all use Microsoft 365. I think it's a mainstay for business. But in this presentation, we're talking about something which is very important. We're talking about your backup checklist. How do you do that within the 365 eco space? I think that's very, very important to understand. I think this webinar will be very, very interesting and certainly insightful for everyone that's joining us today. Now, you have a presentation for us, Mircea. So what I'd like you to do is maybe kick that off, and we'll have a conversation as we go through each slide. So if you'd like to start that off for us, we'll have a conversation as we go. But I think it should be very interesting, a very interesting presentation today. So 365 backup, it's something that a lot of businesses are talking about.
Indeed, so this will be a checklist on M365 backup for this year, and we'll dive into also what backup really means.
Yep.
What does the landscape look like, and what are some of the considerations that government agencies and organizations have to take into account?
Indeed.
And now, first off, just looking at SaaS applications, why they are not immune to data loss. Taking a quick look at the landscape, we observed that in a past year, how many orgs have experienced data loss or corruption. Surprisingly, 53% have said yes for just the past 12 months. And this is a pretty scary stat, but even scarier is on the right-hand side, the percentage of organizations that have experienced data loss or data corruption, and how many of them were actually not prepared. As you can see, 50% of them know they are partially responsible with protecting the data. So we know that we are in charge and we should prepare for these attacks.
Do you find also that businesses are paying more attention to this now? They are seeing the SaaS landscape in particular, that's core to their business. But it's also very important for them to look at how they are backing up their backing up their systems. Are you, when you're talking to your customer base, are you hearing that from the customer base that this is a clear and present danger which they must do something about today? They must take action.
So indeed, we are definitely sensing an increase when it comes to protecting against cyber attacks, especially against ransomware, not only accidental data deletion or data corruption. And we are seeing awareness being raised among our customers base, be them government agencies or just private organizations, for example.
Yes, because it doesn't matter who you are. If you're a private business, if you're a government agency, the risks are very, very similar, and you must take steps to look at your data backup, how you're covering your assets, and particularly for Microsoft 365, it's an absolute, it's a given. You must look at that no matter which sector you're in.
Indeed, and I think that also a lot of the companies realized that the potential of data loss brings in way higher costs as opposed to just protecting the data.
Yeah.
Especially for public companies, for those that are publicly traded. So it can have a real impact that can be sensed from the first minute. Now, going further. So just a second, please. switching off the screens. Now, as we mentioned, so quickly looking at some key risks and that organizations are recognizing. As you can see, you might guess what are the primary reasons for protecting the data. We can see that ransomware is on everybody's mind. Again, cybersecurity attacks, this is what even the SaaS admins and also the backup admins agree on, what is the primary risk.
Indeed.
Compliance and regulations, so I'm sure these are on many minds these days as well, especially with GDPR, right to be
Absolutely.
forgotten, and many other laws. And we also have to ask ourselves if we need more tools to essentially hand that individual file or document to my HR, to my audit, or to my legal team, or to my compliance officer. And if we also have the restoration capabilities that we need to restore this data.
Yes, and it's a very interesting list that goes literally from, I guess, what you would assume you would have as a point of attack on cybersecurity. But it goes much further than that, doesn't it? Your list is very interesting because, as you say, it literally goes from regulation of your legal team all the way through to HR and everyone else in between. I think the conversation we're having in this presentation is very timely because it's company wide. Everyone has, I guess, everyone has a stake in that, don't they? Everyone is touched by 365, and therefore everyone must be touched by how you manage the security aspect of that, and particularly backing up your data. It's not just an IT issue, is it? It's an issue for your entire business.
Indeed, so this is the main change nowadays. So we realize that DR is not just an IT problem; it can be an entire business or operations problem.
Indeed.
And many of us are hopefully aware that there is an unspoken contract between our organizations and Microsoft in this case, which hinges on where our responsibility ends and where Microsoft's begins.
Sure.
And while Microsoft is in charge of the service, the uptime of the infrastructure, so making sure that our org has access to the service, is their responsibility and the service uptime. But that's where we start getting into our territory.
Yep.
And we have to make sure that we have control of the data.
Do you often find with your customer base that that's an area of either confusion or an area of contention, that the responsibility for that is, do they automatically assume that it's the vendor, that they have responsibility for that, when actually that's not the case? You have to take responsibility yourself and use third parties to help you do that. I do hear that a lot, that, well, I bought this system from someone. Isn't it not their responsibility to make it secure? Well, no, that's not the case at all. You must understand that security is not just vendor specific. It has to be something that your business creates based on the kind of ecosystem your business has. It's not the vendor.
So indeed, this, I would say, it used to be a common misconception, like it's in the cloud, it's backed up, or it's safe.
Yeah.
However, I think that more and more customers are realizing these days that that is not true. And once they have the internal business case built, it typically translates into a backup project.
Yep, sure.
And
Sure.
as you can see, and what's also really interesting about the statistics, as you can see, accidental deletion of data fell quite a lot, as this used to be the main reason for backing up the data like a few years ago.
Yep.
But as you can see, as the markets change and we see a lot more on the cybersecurity attacks right now, first off, cybersecurity is just on top of the list.
Well, absolutely, yes. And the interesting one there, of course, towards the bottom is the internal threats. They are still a clear and present danger. That security isn't just a outward in; it has to be an inward out as well. You have to look at your internal systems and say, okay, what kind of internal threats might I be opening my business for? How does Microsoft 365 factor into that? And then try and create the two together, isn't it? It's not just something that attacks from outside. That is absolutely true, ransomware, etc., of course. But the interesting one on your slide for me is the internal threats. That's an interesting one, because often I think businesses maybe don't pay enough attention to that, and really they should.
Indeed, so I think this one comes into two flavors. First off, it's either a disgruntled employee.
Yep.
So maybe he does that by will, or maybe it's just a departing employee that just goes there and deletes the data, even if it should be company property and the
Sure.
data should not be
Sure.
removed.
Sure.
But it can also be a user that got an elevated level of access and they just go and delete the
Yep.
data, assuming that it shouldn't be there as well. So a lot of use cases for these malicious or internal threats.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Plus, also, I think another interesting one, it's about the departments that handle external documents.
Yeah.
Let's say somebody from an HR department receives a CV on a Dropbox account. They just go and download it and realize it's a ransomware.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have multiple ways of delivering these payloads.
Yes, and the core, I guess, of this conversation is, excuse me, that all of that which you just outlined, all that can be mitigated, can't it? All that can be kind of the challenge there is to say, okay, how do we do that? Well, you do that by making sure your data's backed up. If you do that, then it doesn't kind of matter what happens. You're confident that you can do a restoration because that's the other side of the coin, isn't it? If you're trying to put something in place to back up 365, that's the important thing to do, absolutely, because restoration after an event, that's very important. How do we recover? And often I think that's often not thought about in enough detail. How are we going to recover if something does happen? But frankly, if you've backed all your data up, then you're in a very good place.
Indeed, so all of these concerns translate into how a backup really makes sense to us. And of course, a backup doesn't make sense without the restore capabilities.
Yep.
And this is where I would delve into our checklist, actually. So
Indeed.
first of all, why we need a backup and what we need to look into our when we look for backup solutions.
Indeed.
So first of all, as we are looking at different third-party backup vendors, let's think about deployment flexibility. We may want to deploy on-prem initially, but there may be circumstances down the road where we might want to move that on-prem deployment to a public cloud or
Yep.
to a private cloud,
Yep.
or even give that responsibility to one of our backup as a service vendors.
Yep.
The key is to work with a third-party backup vendor that won't lock you in a particular deployment.
Okay.
Also, what we strongly advocate for is, as you can see, backup storage freedom. So again, this trickles not only into the deployment itself, but also the storage, because we know there are many situations where you might want to leverage your on-prem repository initially.
Cool.
But like many orgs, you might want to scale out to object storage, for example.
Yeah.
And even as you are planning that, you might realize you don't have enough storage on-prem and you have to move to a hyperscaler.
Is there a trend in the marketplace that you see? Are people either looking to expand on prem, or is it really not a wholesale move to more sort of cloud based or remote? Is it something in the middle? Are people building sort of hybrid storage for their businesses? So it's a little bit of both, or are you seeing a trend which is literally it is all moving to a sort of cloud base?
I think as the amount of data grew, we are seeing this cloud adoption.
Mm.
However, there are also a lot of companies that migrated to the cloud and then opted to maybe download the data and just host it on-prem for the time being.
Okay, yeah,
So we are
yeah.
seeing the circle
It's
completing
going around,
itself,
yeah.
the cycle completing.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it?
Uh,
That the cloud isn't it kind of isn't there for businesses as a core. It's a very useful source, but when you kind of get into what you were talking earlier about business cases, it may be the case that the vast majority of your data does sit on a cloud service somewhere, but for particularly for application speed and for access for low latency, you may want to move that to on-prem. And if you move it back to on-prem, then you have to start thinking about, well, what's the storage going to look like? Is it going to be direct access? Is it going to be some kind of a storage network? Because that gives you the performance, doesn't it?
Yes, the performance, but we are also looking at data governance. So we have specific sectors that just have to keep the data on-prem, not reachable via, of course, public internet endpoints and so on.
Let's not forget compliance. Yeah, it's always in the mix.
With the cloud, indeed, you might have some strong native capabilities like object storage at rest encryption, for example,
Yep.
or native immutability. However, having the flexibility to also adopt the on-prem part whenever you'd like to, it's, I think, a very important point for a backup solution.
Yep. Indeed. Yep.
And there are many vendors that will lock you in a particular ecosystem, and they'll make it difficult for you to leave, and they might even penalize you for taking the data out of their systems. So, of course, having an
Yes.
exit strategy
Mm.
is also an optimal thing when looking at a backup solution.
Sure.
Now, I would recommend also taking a hybrid approach to backups. So there are many vendors which are limited to just M365 online services, for
Yeah.
example. They don't cover the on-prem Exchange or SharePoint environments. Sometimes you don't know what type of event will trigger the need to restore. Did
Absolutely.
it originate on-prem
Mhm.
or in my M365 environment? So if an attack originates on-prem and it gets synced via OneDrive or in some other way to the cloud environment, we have to make sure that we have the full spectrum of protection into our system, and we streamline our backup to make sure that we can recover the whole organization, not only the online part of things.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. That if you start to get into creating hybrid data silos, if you like, or storage, it's some of it's on-prem, some of it's in the cloud. You got to protect both, haven't you? And you've got to back up both of those areas because, as you say, a lot of this data is synced across various devices. Let's not forget that all of those are potential risks and potentially endpoints for security breach. So how do you do that? So having a system in place gives you that. I guess it's an overview, isn't it? That you know that all the data is backed up, no matter where it resides, because there's a backup system in place which takes account of all of that. Because a lot of businesses, I think, are doing more of that. They're saying, well, let's use the data very intelligently, but it could be in various locations. So how do we make sure we have an overall backup solution? That's kind of what Veeam's about, isn't it? It's that overall ecosystem of a backup.
Yes, indeed. And it's not only about backing up the data for the long term, for example, for the
Mm.
on-prem part,
Yeah, yeah,
but what we can do is to also back up the on-prem part prior to migrating it to the cloud.
sure.
Because, of course, we've seen companies that lost some of their on-prem data due to not paying enough attention, let's say, to the retention policies or to how they perform the migration.
Sure.
And it typically happened to the long-standing users, like data that has been there for 15 years or other such use cases, for example.
I'm with you. Sure.
Now, the next point is controlling the scope of our backup. And it means being able to backup teams, user sites individually on a granular level, or
Yeah,
maybe the entire organization if we want to do that.
I'm with you. Sure.
So we have to choose how we want to protect the environment, and also maybe we want to exclude the service accounts as we maybe don't want them to take up licenses. This is another functionality that we want to
Sure.
have. The granularity allowing us to target individual users, M365 groups, security or distribution groups, teams, personal or group SharePoint sites, and so
Yeah.
on.
So it's that
So
ability to you're talking about making the system very bespoke for your business. You can choose how you do that, and that's the power of the system. Is that it's not limiting. You can decide users, groups, teams in the entire organization. The point is it's flexible enough so you decide. We're not going to tell you how to do that. You decide how you set the system up, and that gives you the backup solution that you absolutely need for your business.
indeed, so we don't want to be limited in our scoping. We might not want to back up everything or not at
Yeah,
first.
yeah,
Maybe
sure.
some VIP users need
Yeah,
to be backed up way more often. And maybe we want to also set up some individual schedules based on specific user groups RPOs. We want to also do that.
that's an interesting one. Do you often talk to your clients and say, "Well, let's look at your data"? There's that thing about data quality, isn't there? Because all data isn't the same. Should you back up everything? Is there certain data sets which you don't really need to pay that closely attention to? Do you often have those conversations where a business will say, "Well, we have all of this data," and you say, "Well, do we need to back up everything? Is that really necessary?" That's an interesting conversation because I think most people think a backup is everything. But it doesn't have to be, does it?
Yes, so I think most of the times we see some more attention being just a second, please.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, back. Indeed, most of the times we see a lot more attention being spent on the C-level or D-level executives. For
Sure.
example, within a company, so they have way tighter RPOs, like
Yeah,
maybe they have their data backed up once every 5 to 10 minutes. But for all of the other users, again, since these backups are not affecting the production environment at all, they can even run during the working day.
absolutely.
And it means that we can back up as often as every hour or once every 8 hours, totally up to us. And we'll also get notifications, so we'll know from the get-go when a backup failed, when it threw some warnings. So we'll also know when to do some preemptive actions to maybe avoid running into another issue.
Sure, absolutely.
And of course, this is another thing that we want from our backup system, the ability to monitor it and to also receive notifications based on backup job behavior. Now, I'm sure there are many orgs on the line that started adopting Teams, especially during the pandemic.
Indeed.
But in any case, many of them also rushed to deploy Teams.
Absolutely. Yes.
Now, there is the understanding with Teams that it brings together multiple abstraction layers, grouping data from multiple services.
Yeah, indeed.
So, for example, from Exchange Online, we got the contacts, we got the meetings, the calendars. We've got team files in SharePoint Online and also chat files in OneDrive for business, and making sure that we have a backup solution with the latest Teams API. We can back up Teams in the way it's supposed to with most efficiency. So we are backing up also the configuration, the members, the structure.
Okay. Yeah.
Basically anything that Veeam the Teams data entitles. Now we've looked at how to backup individual objects, users, sites, but we also need to tailor how often we backup each individual department.
Sure.
So again, it ties back to our previous discussion on how to scope our backups.
Yeah, indeed.
So of course, it's extremely important to keep our RPOs on top of our mind. The main question is how much data are we willing to lose? And also for the RTO, it's how long does it take to actually restore the data? And this can be controlled through the amount of compute resources that we might provide to our system. If RPO and RTO are not established, we have to make sure to keep them on top of the priority list. Some backup vendors, they can backup multiple times a day. Some are limited to once every 20 minutes and so on.
Yep.
Or some like Veeam, so we can backup, as I said, as often as every 5 minutes, and it's set on a per job basis.
Yeah.
So we can create as many jobs as you'd like until you target the entire environment.
Oh, I see. So, so your system's intelligent in that it looks at, well, it asks the business what you want to back up, how often do you want to back that up. But let's look at that really business wide to make sure that the systems we have in place aren't impacting your objects at all. They aren't impacting, your ability to do your work, because no one's going to really want a system which slows the network while it's backing up. No one would want that. Your system's intelligent enough to say, well, we can back up at times when it's not going to be inconvenient. We can back up continuously if you feel that's necessary. I mean, I think the interesting one on this slide is that the amount of time, when do you back up? So between each backup, you're minimizing the data loss risk. That's the important thing. Now, you decide when that's going to be. It could be 5 minutes or whatever it is. Also, what you back up across your business. You do all of that as a business case, and that makes your business much more efficient because you're backing the data up, but it's not impacting on process.
Indeed, so we can back up, as I said, as often as every 5 minutes, but what's recommended is to target just these VIP users, C-level, D-level executives, or a specific department.
Sure.
because we'll still get notifications, we'll still send API calls to Microsoft for this
Yeah.
data, and
Yep.
we might just hit some rate limits if we do this backup
Okay.
job for the entire environment. But it's totally up to us on how we set up these policies, and we can also retry all of the failed tasks with our
Yeah.
built-in retry logic.
Indeed. Yeah. Because something's going to fail, but you need to be aware of that, because if you're not, data then becomes older. The backups become almost legacy, and some of that data could be important. It really could have a value, and you need to be aware of that. I think your system it's kind of early warning, isn't it? There's something's happened here, guys. Something's failed. Go and have a look at that particular data set. Why did that not back up correctly? And the fact that your system can highlight that's very powerful for data managers, isn't it?
Indeed, so we'll have specific errors. We'll know if the file maybe was too large, maybe all of the
Yeah.
threads were already in use at that point in time,
Indeed.
and we just
Sure.
got a timeout. So we can adapt it based on the errors that we see, and of course fix the errors. And when it comes to RPO, so as I said, what's extremely important, we can set up, for example, certain departments to be backed up on specific timeframes. And the benefit is that we can tailor our backup specifically to the amount of time we need to keep the data loss as limited as possible. As
Sure.
this is the end goal, just
That's it.
limiting the data loss and also the RTO.
Okay.
Now, as we also said, the backups are nothing without, let's say, granular recovery options. We can restore the data to the original location or to a new one. If a company is audited, we can export or send the data, making sure that we have all of the scenarios that an organization needs covered in the restore options. And while looking further, as we're going to take a deeper look into Veeam's recovery capabilities, it's important to also make a checklist of the restore options when looking up the vendors, because you might not just want to restore in place or to the original location.
Yes, absolutely. Even simple things like hard drive failure. You don't want to recover back to that because it failed. So where do you want to put that? I mean, that list is quite exhaustive. That you can basically choose really where you want to restore that data back to. Again, it minimizes the lag in your business because you know where that's going to recover to. If you think about that in your business case and when you're setting it up, then you'll have a very smooth restoration process because you know instantly where each piece of data should be recovered back to. So if you know that, what it recovers the data, but it doesn't impact your business's process. I think that's the important thing. I think a lot of people think, oh, we put this in place, it's going to slow our networks, it's going to have an impact on process. Well, actually, no, it doesn't. If you set this up properly, then you'll recover your data back to a location which you choose, and that's the important thing. You choose it, and it doesn't impact on process.
Indeed, and what I think it's also important, especially if a company is going through a lot of acquisitions or mergers.
Yeah.
We might also want a backup solution that can migrate the data from one tenant to the other.
That's a very good point. Yeah.
And as we'll integrate, for example, a second Microsoft tenant or third into our solution, we might want to migrate the data from the first one to the second one.
Yeah.
So we don't want to use a migration solution and then a backup solution. If they can be integrated all in one, for example, like Veeam can do, I think it would be the best approach.
Yes, it's all in one place. You do not need to create a backup solution because it's all in one place. It can do everything for you.
Yes, and of course this also targets the hybrid setups. So if you want to migrate the data from on-prem Exchange to Exchange Online, it can also be done through the backup solution that we might want to use. And lastly, so based on our survey, as we could see, compliance is huge. If we can explore these backups through granular search and find capabilities, again, another very important factor.
Indeed.
Whether we can explore a single organization or all of them at specific points in time, we should be able to see the latest available state or point in time, or the earliest one to get the data with need to. So we've looked at a solution checklist. Now to quickly summarize. So for features, we need to make sure that we can backup all of the services that we want to backup.
Indeed.
We have to make sure that we can deploy it how we want, utilize the
Yep.
storage that we want. We don't want any lock-ins. Of course, we want an exit strategy, while making sure that we can also set up a flexible schedule for our backup jobs.
Yep. Indeed.
We want to work with a vendor that is improving and innovating, and also maybe a vendor that keeps its ears open towards the customers, listening to feedback on improvements. And we have to make sure that they are simplifying things and provide different support measures.
Yep.
We have to also make sure that we got the scale. There are lots of companies that work with vendors and then they realize maybe this is more of an SMB solution, maybe there is limited scalability. So we have to work with a vendor that can grow with us. Now also looking at what are the different integration points, what is the ecosystem, are they S3 compatible? Again, do I have an exit strategy, which I think it's a very important thing.
Indeed.
And then maybe I don't want to backup just my M365 service, but also my other workloads,
Everything else.
be it
Yeah.
Salesforce, VMs, physical machines, cloud compute instances. We just want to unify under single umbrella all of the workloads that we need to backup to achieve some consistency across my backup solution.
Yes, I think that's important to get across. Is that this system is not just for 365. It's company wide. This solution can be applied to any kind of virtual or physical data. It's not just for 365.
Yes, and maybe we want to have a single pane of glass to monitor my entire infrastructure, like my on-prem servers, my M365 piece.
Indeed.
We might also want to look at a vendor that can achieve all of this to, again, have some consistency across my environment. And this leads us into Veeam, taking a quick look at infrastructure freedom, how we control our backups, recovery flexibility, and also scalability. And I think all of them make Veeam different compared to a lot of other as-a-service vendors. So, as I said, we can backup Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, OneDrive for Business, and Teams data, allowing you to leverage the deployment you need, the storage you need, and we can move again from one storage system to another. For the backup control piece, as I said, we can achieve RPOs as low as 5 minutes, and they can be tiered based on data criticality, again, setting individual RPOs based on user groups, for example. For recovery options, all in all, we have more than 50 different recovery mechanisms. And for scalability, so we may scale up or out based on our proxy component design. We can restore multiple users at once or even all mailboxes instead of restoring one item at a time.
Sure.
And we also have PowerShell and APIs to automate specific tasks to achieve the desired workflow.
Okay.
Right now, in our latest product version, we had a lot of comments requesting that we have not just a backup copy, but we also want an immutable one. So we've now got immutable backup copies, and these can be stored in S3 compatible or Glacier, like the archive storage.
Sure.
Another compliance tool is the advanced monitoring capability. So we're integrating with Veeam One, and this will allow us to use an at-a-glance dashboard, alarm and reporting capabilities to meet compliance requirements. Plus, it will also give us an in-depth look into our backup environment.
Sure.
And also for our backup as a service options via our VCSPs. So we implemented the built-in service portal to grant a role-based access type of authentication without providing elevated privileges to the Veeam Backup 365 machine.
I'm with you.
And the same feature may also be enabled to allow their end users to do their own restores. So we maybe can reduce the load on the IT department as the users don't have to create tickets anymore. They can just do their own restores to the original location if they want to do that.
Super.
Now for a deeper dive. So we've talked about the applications and the importance of a hybrid environment backup solution. On-prem M365, we want to work with a streamlined data protection tool that allows us to store the data on a variety of storage options. and maybe we want to leverage S3 compatible or on-prem local storage, we can do that. We'll have the option to also do immutable backup copies and use Microsoft Azure Blob or Archive and S3 compatible, and regardless of where you store the data, we can use our explorers to restore it, send it, save it, or export it, or offer, as I said, also the self-service restore options.
Yes, it's that ecosystem again, isn't it? That everything is kind of built in, and that you decide how you deploy whichever elements that you need for your particular enterprise.
Indeed, and with all of the recovery options, so we can restore, for example, the data in place by preserving, while also preserving the metadata. So the original sender, the original data it was received, and so on, just like the object was never deleted. We can send it as a new item. We can save it locally, or we can export it again, making it also a great tool for audit or legal reasons.
Indeed.
And lastly, all, it's encompassed by the Veeam One dashboard, intelligent reports, and real-time alerts. So this is how the solution looks and the various components at a high level. Now, looking at all of the different restore options, here we have a sneak peek. We can restore, as I said, the item to another location, to another tenant, if the company is going through a migration or a merger.
Indeed.
And we can also send the items straight to a mail address. So whether it's restoring missing Teams memberships, prior file versions, or just the permission of a SharePoint file, we can do all of this. Now, as you can see, we have up to, let's say, 30,000 customers today and 14 million protected users, and we have some samples of who is protecting the data with Veeam. So Loomis, a security firm, West Farmers, Staples, City of New Orleans. So lots of state type organizations, lots of schools and other public organizations.
Yes, and the interesting that's a very interesting graphic because it is a huge mix of different businesses, which I think is important to get across at the Veeam solution is that it's not just for one particular business or one particular sector. It can be used by everyone, and that's everyone from local authorities through to large organizations. It's flexible enough to be useful for all of those businesses.
Indeed, so since our solution is pretty easy to maybe scale up or out due to our component design, plus we can use the on-prem or cloud storage, it means that we can address and implement the same piece of software also for SMBs, but also for the enterprise or for the bigger businesses.
Well, that's a very good point. That it does scale. So if your business, as you say, any mergers, any acquisitions, or your business is growing, this is a solution which will grow with you. That's kind of very important as well. That you're not going to have to look for another 365 backup solution when your business grows. That's not the case because the Veeam solution is that it grows with your business.
Indeed, and since there's no lock-in, since of course we are in charge with the infrastructure, we are in charge with the storage system, it means that we'll always have an exit strategy. We will always be able to restore our data from a backup already created by Veeam. It's just a matter that with an expired Veeam license, we won't be able to create new backups from that point on, just for a limited set of users. With M365, just for up to 10 users. But other than that, if you specify your retention policy and you want to keep the data for 15 years with Veeam, you'll be able to restore that data 15 years from now on with our trial license.
Excellent.
Now, as we can see, we are also a leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant. We are part of Forbes Top 100 Best Cloud Companies and a Microsoft Gold partner for more than 5 years already.
Sure.
But without taking my word for it and looking at what we have checked in a backup solution, we can see it for ourselves. So we can compare Veeam against other backup vendors by going on Trust Radius, for example. So again, this is our call to action. Look at G2, look at Trust Radius, and do some research and see what other customers are saying to get a brief overview of their on their experiences. And now, quick call to action. So you may get your QR scanners ready, as we have some more QR codes before we part ways. First one is the Gartner report. This is not Veeam specific, and this is Gartner's take on should organizations back up this data. Maybe you have some peers that you work with that are not convinced on whether you have to back up the data. But Gartner offers that non-biased take on what they are seeing and what the need is around the market and around protecting the critical data.
Sure.
If you are interested in more technicalities on our solution, I recommend this guide to get a quick picture on the different technicalities and how we actually prepare for a backup. It helps with sizing and also other aspects. Now we can offer you a free 30-day trial, and with it you get complete unlimited capabilities, and after that you still have access to the product and it is actually free. So as I said, with the community edition version, you can back up to 10 users for free. Maybe just try it out for your C-suite, maybe for a small department. So you are more than welcome to do that completely free for up to 10 users. This was it from me. Thank you for joining. And if you have any questions, you can shoot them my way, and I'll do my best to answer all of them.
That's great. Thanks for that presentation, Mika. I think that was insightful. I thought we covered a lot of ground. I think the actual checklist itself is a very useful tool for, I think, anyone that's trying to evaluate, I guess, how they are going to approach their 365 backup. And of course, data backup across their business. I think it's a timely thing which every business is trying to think about. So I hope that presentation was very useful for everyone listening to us listening today. Well, that's the end of this webinar. I hope the 365 checklist we presented today gives you the practical tools that your enterprise needs to secure backup, really for your deployment of Microsoft 365. You can discover more about the #1 Microsoft 365 backup and recovery solution by visiting veeam.com. Until the next webinar, many thanks for joining us today.